I bet you this is all connected. They had Frito-Lay, didn't they?
Well, as a matter of fact, we do, Tracy Locke does handle a number of Frito-Lay products. We handle Doritos, tortilla chips. In fact, we introduced that product in 1965.
You did?
And we handle Lay's potato chips.
Yeah.
And Tostitos.
Yes.
Corn chips.
And then Pepsi went and bought Frito.
Well, actually, Pepsi-Cola and Frito-Lay merged in 1964, I believe. It, interestingly, did not really have anything directly to do with me or my decisions, nor BBDO and Tracy Locke, though that did make it quite a compatible marriage of the two companies in 1981.
1981.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we left you off at 1972.
When I became president of Tracy Locke.
Tracy Locke. And then what was your next step up?
Well, I continued until 1981, and I became chairman of Tracy Locke. And then we merged with BBDO, and I became continued as chairman of BBDO, and of Tracy Locke, and became executive vice president of BBDO.
And now, what year is this, Norman Campbell?
83.
83. Okay. And
then in early 86, I moved back to New York for the second time as in my current job as chairman of BBDO Worldwide. The result of participating with clients and particularly the people that are in the creative side of the business that actually write and art direct and produce advertising that runs on television and on the radio and newspapers and magazines. I think it's the kind of people who are in the business. They're smart, they're bright, they're fresh, they're creative, they're stimulating, they're good business people. It's a very emotional business. It can be very high and very low, but it's always something different is going on each day and each client and each hour, as a matter of fact.
Now, boys and girls.
Oh, that's right. Glendora has a joke to tell.
This church had a Bible selling contest, and the man who sold the most Bibles stuttered it. And he stuttered badly. And so all the parishioners, but he sold the most Bibles. And so they asked him, well, what did you say to the people to sell the most Bibles? And he said, I just said, do you want to buy a Bible, or do you want me to read it to you?
Glendora. Very good.
Moved it closer, and he says, can you read the sign from here? And Dick said, no. And the optician moved it even more closer, and Dick says, no, I can't read that. And the optician said, why not? And Dick says, well, because I can't read. Now, Dennis said to the hotel doorman, he said, be careful of that great big box. He says, there's a 10-foot snake in there. And the hotel doorman says, you can't fool me. Snakes don't have feet. And this man bought a new house, and he called it Simla, S-I-M-L-A. And his friend, who knew that the man had been traveling all over the world, he says, that's an interesting name, S-I-M-L-A. Did you bring that back all the way from India? And the man says, no. He says, I called it Simla because it's similar to the other houses on the street. And the judge said to the dentist, do you swear to pull the tooth, the whole tooth, and nothing but the tooth? Doug said to the store owner, can I try on that navy blue suit in the window? And the store owner says, no, you'll have to do it in the dressing room. Don said to his 5-year-old friend, they're not going to grow bananas any longer. And his little 5-year-old friend says, why not? And Don says, because they're long enough right now. A railroad commuter had a lot of fun. He went up to the public address system, and he made the following announcement. The train coming in on tracks 5, 6, and 7 is coming in sideways. Mom said to Dad, how did we ever get that flat tire? And the 7-year-old son said, it must have been that fork in the road. A very pompous man was strutting around an art gallery, and he stood in front of an object, and he says, I suppose this hideous monstrosity is an example of modern art. And his friend says, no, that's what you call a mirror. Now, Bob said to Alan, he says, you remind me of Dennis Green. And Alan says, I'm not a bit like Dennis Green. And Bob says, yes, you are. Both of you owe me $5. And painting, Bill took up painting. He was very excited that he took up painting professionally. And so his friend says, well, good for you. He says, have you sold anything yet? And Bill says, yes, I've sold my watch, my TV set, and my car. And somebody asked Arthur, why was he always so well behaved? And Arthur said, well, he says, when I was a little boy and I was well behaved, my daddy would give me a penny, and he'd give me a pat on the head. So by the time I was 17, I had $32 and a very flat head. Alan said to his friend, you see that man across the street? I owe more to that man than to any man on earth. And his friend says, really? Who is that man? And Alan says, my landlord. Joe was trying to impress his new girlfriend, folks, and he says, my father was an exporter. And Joe's buddies whispered to her, that's right, he was an exporter. He used to work for Amtrak. This is Glendora, a cheerful look at life. Keep the courage flaming, please. Hi there, folks. How are you today? And welcome to Glendora, a cheerful look at life. The steward was trying to comfort the passenger, and the steward says, I know that everywhere you look there's water, but I want you to know that actually we're only 2 miles away from land. And the passenger says, really? And the steward says, yes, straight down. Now, this woman in the train station, she walked up to the ticket counter, and she bought a ticket to go to Buffalo. And the clerk says, this train goes to Buffalo in 10 minutes. And the woman says, really? Last time it took 8 hours. The mountaineer, young mountaineer, was out with the guide for the first time. And the guide says, that's the next cliff that we're going to climb. And the young mountaineer, he was scared. And he says, wow, do people often fall off that cliff? And the guide says, no, once is usually enough. Mrs. Morgan said to Emily, she says, that's very rude of you to keep reaching across the table and taking cakes. Don't you have a tongue? And Emily says, well, yes, I do, but my arms are longer. A man had a portrait made, and the artist says, what do you think of my portrait of you? And the man says, well, it's just like me. It looks better at a distance. Here's another ad for you in the newspaper. For sale, an umbrella by a lady with broken ribs. Now, on a tombstone, there was this writing, and it said, it was by a hypochondriac. It was a tombstone of a hypochondriac, and this is what it said on the tombstone. See, I told you I was sick. And a bachelor went into a furniture store, and he says, I want to buy a mattress. And the clerk says, a spring mattress? And the bachelor says, no, I'd like one that I can sleep on all the year around. Eddie said to his little friend, he says, I see that your father has shaved his beard again. Why, that's the third time this year. And his little friend says, well, it's my mother's fault. She's stuffing a cushion. And Bob said to the professor, the college professor, is it hard to become a professor? And the professor says, no, you do it by degrees. Helen said to Patsy, your umbrella has seen better days. And Patsy says, yes, it's had its ups and downs. And Paul said, Dad, what's a Grecian urn? And Dad says, oh, about $5 an hour. The pastor said to Billy, if you found $1, would you keep it? And Billy says, oh, no, sir. And the pastor says, good. What would you do with it? And Billy says, I'd spend it. Folks, what's the opposite of a cock-a-doodle-doo? A cock-a-doodle-don't. Now, John said to his employee, I saw you arguing with that customer. And in this store, you never argue with the customer. Is that clear? And the employee says, yes, sir, that's clear. And the boss says, now, what were you arguing about? And the employee says, he said you were an idiot. What is the longest word in the English language? Smiles. Between the first letter and the last letter is a mile. And Mrs. Morgan was teaching the children about various plants, and she says, toadstools are found in damp places. And Bobby says, oh, he says, that's why they're shaped like umbrellas. Now, what is out of bounds? Mrs. Morgan says, what does out of bounds mean? And Teddy says, out of bounds? That must be an exhausted kangaroo. And little Billy did not like to hear his sister practice her singing. It kind of got on his nerve. And he says, sis, I wish that you would sing only Christmas carols. And his sister says, really? Why? Billy says, because then you'd only have to practice once a year. Cheerful look at life, folks. Keep the courage flaming, please. Hi folks, how are you today? This is Glendora, a cheerful look at life. And Paula was taking voice lessons, and her neighbor asked her, how do you think you're coming? Do you think your voice is improving? And Paula says, maybe, but it isn't cured yet. And Pat told his little friend that his big sister was putting lemon juice on her face to give her a good complexion. And his little friend says, ooh, that's what makes her a sourpuss. And Pamela says, this is my husband's enthusiasm stew. It's enthusiasm stew because he puts everything he has into it. And Harriet says to her mother, Mom, you know that vase that's been handed down from generation to generation? And her mother says, yes. And Harriet says, well, this generation just dropped it. And poor little Hazel, she was having a terrible time with catechism in school. And it was so hard, she says, instead of starting her out on catechism, they should have started her out on kittykism. And Andy said to his daddy, can I join the army? And his father says, of course not, you're just an infant. And Andy says, then I could be in the infantry. And Hal says to his mom, Mom, am I made out of sage and parsley and breadcrumbs? And his mother says, no, why not? And little Hal says, well, because Billy said he's going to beat the stuffing out of me. And Dick and his family were going on a vacation. His mother says, do you have everything packed, Dick? And Dick says, sure. And his mother says, well, how about soap? And Dick says, soap? I thought this was a vacation. And Diane was over to her grandmother's house, and her grandmother says, Diane, would you like to see the cuckoo come out of the cuckoo clock? And Diane says, yes, I would, and I'd like to see grandfather come out of the grandfather's clock. Donna was bragging that before she was married, she had plenty of men at her feet. And her mother-in-law says, that's right, she had plenty of men at her feet. They were all podiatrists. David's wife said, I thought you said you were going to go see your dentist this afternoon. And she said, I was going downtown on the bus, and I looked out the window, and I saw you going into the ballpark with a short, fat, bald-headed man. And David says, yes, that's my dentist. And Donald said to his little friend Billy, he says, my brother, my little baby brother, is only a year old, and he's been walking for 9 months. And Billy says, gee, he must be tired. And the teacher said to Louis, is this your brother? And Louis says, yes. And the teacher says, he's kind of small, isn't he?
And Louis says, well, that's okay. He's only my half-brother. And Lynn's mother said to her, now you eat all greens. They'll give you a good complexion. And Lynn says, but I don't want a green complexion. And Anne, it was Christmas time, and Anne drew a picture of Christmas. And the teacher came along. She says, that's very good. That's Jesus, and that's Joseph, and that's Mary. But what is this little box in the corner? And Anne says, that's their TV set. Anthony says, Dad, there's something I can do that you can't do. And his father says, okay, what is it? And Anthony says, grow up. And Mrs. Morgan said to all the kids in the class, what happens to elephants when it rains? And Arthur said, they get wet. Alan said, if a fellow met a fibber in a fallow field, how many F's are there in that? The answer is none. There are no F's in that. And Arnold says to his mom, Mom, is it true that we come from dust? And his mother says, yes, that's true. And Arnold says, well, how come then when I go swimming I don't get muddy? And Alex, his mother said, did you wash up for your piano teacher, for your music lessons? And Alex says, yes, I did. And his mother says, did you wash your ears? And Alex says, yes, I washed the one that's next to my teacher. This is Glendora, a cheerful look at life, folks. Keep the courage flaming, please. Related to us. And Billy said, how? And John says, well, their dog is my dog's brother. Little Priscilla, her mother says, what are you doing? And little Priscilla says, I'm writing a letter to Pam. And her mother says, but Pam can't read. And Priscilla says, that's okay, I can't write either. Bob was in a restaurant, and the waiter put down a plate, and Bob said to the waiter, this plate is wet. And the waiter says, that's not a wet plate, sir, that's your soup. Bud went into a restaurant and had a 3-course meal. It consisted of 2 French fries and 1 pea. And Joni was in a restaurant, and she said to the waitress, this coffee tastes like mud. And the waitress says, that's because it was ground 1 hour ago. And when Billy was in the restaurant, a waitress put down both. Says, what is this? And the waitress says, that's bean soup. And Billy, bean soup? Well, what was it before? Mrs. Morgan was teaching her 4th graders, and she said to the class, something of significance that did not exist 100 years ago. And Tommy says, me. And the next day, Mrs. Morgan was trying to teach the children. She said to Harry, explain to me about love. And Harry says, okay. He says, I like my mother, I like my father, but I love bubble gum. Folks, what would you call a sailor who has 7 children? What would you call a sailor who has 7 children? Daddy. Steve's sister said to him, Steve, how much are 2 and 2? And little Steve says, 4. And his sister says, good. And Steve says, what do you mean good? That's perfect. And Stan was asked, what is the plural of mouse? And he said mice. And then he was asked, what's the plural of goose? And Stan said geese. And then he was asked, what is the plural of baby? And Stan said, twins. Mrs. Morgan said to Ted, if I borrow $10 from your brother and he pays me back $1 a month for 6 months, how much will he owe me? And Ted says, $10. And Mrs. Morgan says, you don't know arithmetic. And Ted says, you don't know my brother. And Tim was asked this question, if I give you 3 pencils today and 4 pencils tomorrow, how many pencils will you have altogether? And Tim said, 8. Mrs. Morgan says, why 8? Tim says, because I already have one now. And Mrs. Morgan was getting really upset with the kids. They wouldn't pay attention, and they wouldn't look at her. And so she was explaining about a hippopotamus, and she says, listen, you kids, you've got to pay attention. You've got to watch me. If you don't watch me, you'll never know what a hippopotamus looks like. Tammy, her writing was so bad that the teacher told her to copy a poem 20 times. And so then she handed it to Mrs. Morgan, and Mrs. Morgan says, but this is only 17 times. And Tammy says, yes, my arithmetic is bad too. And Jason was asked, which is nearer, England or the moon? And Jason says, the moon, because you can see the moon, but you can't see England. And Joan was asked to draw a picture of a tractor hauling a cart. So she drew a picture, but it was just a tractor, and the teacher says, why didn't you draw the picture of the cart? And the Joni says, because the tractor will draw the cart. And Jane was in arts and crafts class. She was telling her mother, and she says, the teacher didn't like what I was making. And her mother says, oh, well, what were you making? And Janie says, mistakes. Dad says, what do you call the outside of a tree? And his little son couldn't think of it. And Dad says, bark, bark. And Bob says, woof, woof. And Billy was asked, what were the Poles doing in Russia in 1940? And Billy says, I guess hold telephone wires. And Brad was asked if he'd read Dickens and if he'd read Shakespeare. No, he had read Dickens. No, he hadn't read Shakespeare. And the teacher says, well, what have you read? And Brad stammered, well, I have read Hare. And Bucky was asked, what birds do you usually find in captivity? And his answer was, jailbirds. And Bill came to school, and his teacher said, where were you yesterday? And Bill says, I was sick. And the teacher said, sick of what? And Bill said, sick of school. European tourists on 57th Street in New York asked a man who happened to be a violinist, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the violinist said, practice, practice. And two men were standing at a bus stop, and one man said to the second man, do you know how long the next bus will be? And the second man said, yes, I do, about 25 feet. This is Glendora, a cheerful look at life. Keep the courage flaming, please. Kind enough to come and see you today. It's Mr. Bill Korab, and he's a group vice president. Would you just tell the boys and girls what that means, group vice president?
Well, it means I run a group of businesses for General Foods.
A group of businesses? I bet they're ones we know, huh?
Well, I hope you do. Kool-Aid.
Yeah, Kool-Aid.
Country Time.
Country Time.
Crystal Light.
Crystal Light.
And Post cereals. Like,
oh, yeah, boy.
Pebbles and Super Sugar Crisp, Raisin Bran.
Yeah, we all know those.
You have to get the right kind of education to get interviewed. So you're doing well in school.
Do well in school.
Getting a college degree, and then ideally working for a couple of years, and then getting an MBA.
Oh, working,
is a good way to get into marketing. However, to be good at marketing, you have to be a consumer. So watch TV, look at movies, look at commercials, work in a grocery store, sell newspapers, do anything to get out among people.
The director of marketing.
Well, I was, I think, rather fortunate. I think I was at the right place at the right time, and I did it within 9 years.
Wow! Andrew, anything else you want to say to the youngsters?
Just study hard, and science can be fun.
Thanks again for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Glendora.
Welcome. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Well, boys and girls, here's Mr. Paul Gluck, who came to see you from UA Columbia. Paul, tell the boys and girls all the things that UA Columbia is and does.
Well, UA Columbia is a cable television operator. We operate systems across the country, and we provide the variety of programming that many of you see in your homes. Obviously, you're a subscriber of ours or a cable company if you're watching this show. And we're, as Manhattan Cable is, or as Adams Russell is, we are a cable operator. And we run the cables into the homes and hopefully provide you with a lot of entertainment and a lot of variety of programming for a reasonable amount of money.
Paul, is UA Columbia connected with United Artists, the movie company?
with United Artists, the movie theater operator.
Oh, the movie theater operator, the
Right.
people who own the
The
theaters?
UA Theaters, United Artists Theaters, and UA Columbia United Cable are the same company.
They're the same company?
Yes.
I see. And then, in addition to the cable operation and the theater operation, have other divisions, Paul?
They have one other division, which is really a fairly new division of the company. It's a real estate division.
Real estate?
Yeah, they have...
Now you're talking money.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly why they set up the division. We had recently some new owners come into the company that found within the corporation a wealth of value in terms of the real estate holdings that the company owned, and it brought in some professional people to manage that part of the assets of the company.
Right. Now, you telephone, you do book work a lot?
I do in the job I'm in now, in the position I'm in now, I do an awful lot of reports. Reports to our corporate office, reports to the State Cable Commission, things of that sort. But I also, whenever the general manager is away from the office, I am kind of looked at to act in his absence.
Sure.
So there are very often times where I am dealing directly with customers, dealing directly with program suppliers or vendors of various services. And it's constantly different people I'm dealing with, a different problem, a different situation. I doubt that I ever do the same thing twice. Or never do it the same way twice, which is that's what I like.
I became a salesman. I became an advertising manager. I became
Yes?
an advertising director.
Wow.
I became vice president of all sales of Dow Jones and Company, and I was on the board. And I became chairman of the Asian Wall Street Journal, which I helped create, and the European Wall Street Journal, which I helped to create.
Really?
And buy properties in Asia, and I've had a fantastic life, traveling all over the world on behalf of my publication.
Ooh, what an interesting career.
And I never, ever didn't want to go to work in the morning.
Really? You liked it that much?
And if you're a young person, there's a couple of criteria I give you on that one.
Yes?
If you don't like your job, get out of it. Get out of it very fast. Because there's nothing worse than going to work someplace you don't want to be and feel like you're being honest. Secondly, you can't do well if you don't like what you're doing. You can only do a good job if you really like what you're doing. You can only do a good job. This is what you want me to do, give advice?
Yes,
I'd love to
please give us advice. Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, you can only do a good job if you do something better than most people do that particular job. And that's something which is not taught in schools very often, but there is a truth that I have found in working through my life.
Yes.
That's when the sales position starts to show. I would never hire anyone that I turned down and they just took it as that and they walked away. I'm glad that we didn't hire them. If then you start to fight, it took me 1 year to get a job with the Wall Street Journal.
Did it?
Oh yeah, I kept coming back. I finally wore them down. And I think the way I got the job was by wearing them down, that if I could wear them down, then I could certainly do the same thing in the open marketplace.
Good.
But somebody who takes no for an answer first place, who wants them? You know, I had an old boss who had a saying, good losers are a dime a dozen. Go work for the opposition. I want people who are very bad losers, you know.
So this Canon too came with it.
No, you have to buy it.
That's a separate.
You have to pay for that edition.
Jeez, I remember you had the first Portapack by Sony here in Jamestown. First one. I still had it. I have it here, but at home I have an old half-inch tape, but I did in Jamestown. God, it's really funny because now I'm at Showtime and it's whatever it is, almost 20 years later or whatever. It seems like 20 years later. It's 15 years later, and the guy who's senior vice president of programming here is a guy named Jim Miller. Now, the only reason I tell you that is because when I was a cameraman in 1969, and I'm wearing an installer's uniform, the guy who is the newsman behind the desk is Jim Miller, who's doing the local news for Uptown Manhattan, and I'm the cameraman. So it's true that people who began in that's exactly right.
You see that,
She
boys
said
and
it
girls?
first. She's been saying it to me for years, as a matter of fact.
You can do that. And in the meantime, your daddy became producer of 60 Minutes, right?
Yeah, 1968. Created 60
Don
Minutes.
Hewitt.
Created 60 Minutes. If I remember, he woke up from a dream. This is true. He woke up, we were out at a beach house that we had out on Fire Island this summer. And he woke up, and he walked in and he said, Stephen, I just had the best idea for a television show. I said, yeah? He said, yeah. It's going to be called 60 Minutes. I swear this is true. He knew the name of the show. He said it's going to have a stopwatch as the logo for the show. He knew that going right in. And he said it's going to be Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, and Harry Reason. He knew that, who he wanted. And there was a new technique, which I don't want to get into because it's technical, but there was a new, in 1968, a new television technique came along called chroma key. And chroma key allowed you to put back